Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am going to teach you how to quote properly in your papers. I've put together a really simple recipe so that you can guarantee that every time you write a paper, you have smoothly integrated quotes. So really, it's simple step-by-step instructions, and the first thing we need to do is gather our ingredients. So there's three ingredients to a properly integrated quote. The first is a significant quote that supports the author's argument. And by author, I mean you. You want to make sure that you have a quote that is going to prove what it is you said you're going to prove. Secondly, you need one integrated lead-in that provides the context of the quote. You want to make sure that you are reminding your reader of when this is taking place, who's saying it, to whom, those types of things. This doesn't mean to summarize the plot. The reader has read the text, so you just need to give them little hints to remind them of when the quote took place. And thirdly, you need one application that applies the quote to the thesis and the topic sentence. Without this, your quote's useless. All it is a quote. So let's go ahead and put this all together. So to prep your ingredients, you want to check the quality of them first and foremost. You want to make sure that your quote is of a proper length and that it's relevant. As far as length goes, you are not allowed to have a quote that is more than 2 typed lines. Secondly, the lead-in. You don't want this to be too informative or plotty, so basically you don't want to regurgitate everything that happened in the book, but you want to make sure that it's not informative. You want to make sure that it's informative enough. Next, application effectiveness. Does your paper, do you immediately make a correlation between the quote and the argument? Again, if you don't do this right away, your reader's just kind of wondering, so what was the purpose of that quote? Is it just to fill space? Is it because the teacher said you have to have a quote? So you want to make sure that it's relevant and that you apply it. And then thirdly, word choice. Is the phrasing of your lead-in and your application elementary or sophisticated? Remember, we want to make sure that you really have a good zing to your writing. You don't want to have bland food. You don't want to have bland writing. All right. So next, the perfect quote. Picking the perfect quote. Your quote should, 1, support the main idea and argument of your paragraph. Otherwise, it's irrelevant and it doesn't belong. Again, it's kind of like throwing a football onto the basketball court. You want to make sure instead the only thing that you're throwing onto the basketball court is basketball. Next, support the topic sentence and thesis statement. This goes with the whole idea of relevancy. Third, be something that you cannot easily put into your own words or paraphrase. So don't give a quote that you can really put into your own words simply. And if that's the case, just put it in your own words. Instead, you want to use quotes that the author's word choice and the description can't be recreated effectively. Fourth, as I mentioned before, you are not to have more than 2 typed lines for your quote. And fifth, this is incredibly important. You should not ever have a quote that is dialogue between 2 or more characters. If you want to utilize dialogue, only utilize one person's speech and paraphrase the other part and include that in your context. So let's take a look at these 4 quotes. Which of these following quotes would best support a topic sentence? Sorry about that. Would best support a topic sentence about Clarice causing Montag to change? Number 1, but what would he whisper? What would he yell? What could he say? Number 2, will you turn the parlor off, he asked. That's my family. Number 3, are you happy? Clarice said. And number 4, and then very slowly as he walked, he tilted his head back in the rain for just a few moments and opened his mouth. Okay, let's take this step by step, or quote by quote. The first one, but what would he whisper? What would he yell? What could he say? This is when he's trying to figure out what he could say to Mildred in order to have a conversation. So yes, it is relevant because he's trying to have a conversation, but at the same time, the quote isn't really proving that Clarice is causing him to change. Number 2, will you turn the parlor wall off? Okay, here he is actually asking Mildred to do something different. So he's asking her to turn it off so that they can have a conversation. But I could easily put into my own words, Mildred asked her to turn the parlor walls off. Or Mildred asked her, or he asked Mildred to turn the TVs off. Number 3, are you happy? This is not proving that Clarice is causing Montag to change. Instead, this is a question that she asks that causes him later to think about himself and his life. But again, it's not proving the change in and of itself. Also, I could paraphrase this. Number 4, and then very slowly, as he walked, he tilted his head back in the rain for just a few moments and opened his mouth. This is our winner quote. Now, you may be looking at this and say, this is more than 2 typed lines, but this is a larger font than what you're going to use. You're going to use a 12-point font, and if I change this to 12-point font, it will be less than 2 typed lines. But let's talk about why this is a good quote. This is a good quote because here you have Montag actively changing his behavior immediately after meeting Clarice. And we'll go through that a little bit more. So the lead into the quote. You don't want to leave your quote hanging in midair. Otherwise, as I said before, it's just thrown in there and it doesn't make any sense. So what you're going to do instead is provide the context. This is going to be your lead-in. You want to have your who, what, when, where, why, and how. So if you take a look at this quote that we just had, well, who is this about? It's about Montag. What is going on? He's tasting rain for the first time ever. When is it happening? It's happening immediately after Clarice leaves after their second meeting. Where is it happening? It's happening outside. Why is it happening? Because he's curious to find out if rain does taste like wine, as Clarice suggested, and how does it happen? This is really not applicable. I guess I could explain it happened by him tilting his head back and opening his mouth, but that's just restating the quote. So I'm going to use this information that I just gathered, and I'm going to really kind of discern what is important to talk about before the quote. So let's take a look at some examples. Which of these lead-ins is best for the quote and the topic sentence? Number 1, Montag, very slowly as he walked. Number 2, after Clarice leaves, Montag tilts his head back in the rain. Number 3, to show that he is changing, Montag, very slowly as he walked. Or number 4, intrigued by Clarice's words and take on the world, Montag, after Clarice leaves, very slowly as he walked, tilted his head back. Number 1, that's not a lead-in. One word is not a lead-in. It's not providing context. It's just a word. So that one's out. Number 2, after Clarice leaves, Montag tilts his head. Well, I guess, but it's very plot-like and doesn't really provide any insight. Number 3, to show that he is changing, Montag, very slowly. Montag doesn't do this action of tilting his head back to catch the rain to show that he's changing. So this would not be an effective lead-in. Number 4, intrigued by Clarice's words and take on the world, Montag, after she leaves, or Clarice leaves, very slowly as he walked, tilted his head back in the rain. This is definitely our winner of a lead-in because it's showing why he's doing this, which is because he's intrigued. And it's also telling us when, and it's telling us who. So it's really providing a lot of context. Also notice that for all 4 of these, it's a complete sentence. It's a perfect marriage of my words and Bradbury's words together to create a complete sentence. You can't just put your words and then slap on the author's words and then say it's a complete sentence if in fact it's a run-on. You want to make sure that it makes sense. All right, so you're going to blend the quote and the lead-in until it's smooth, just as we talked about. And then we have to add in the last ingredient, which is the application. So you're going to apply the quote to your main argument. So I think of this as plating the dish. I'm a huge Top Chef watcher, and I love watching Chopped as well. And for those of you who ever watch cooking shows, one of the main judging points is presentation. So you want to think of your application as a beautiful presentation of the dish. You could have a really sloppy presentation like that. That's pretty disgusting, and I am not wanting to eat that ever. Or you can have an artistic application of your quote, like this. I mean, here you can see the chef very delicately and precisely placing the last ingredient onto the plate to make sure that not only is this meal flavorful, but it's also beautiful to look at. So we're appealing to multiple senses here. So how are we going to do this with our writing? So I want you to consider the why and the how the quote proves your point. So here we are back to these why and how questions. So why does the quote, and then very slowly as he walked, he tilted his head back in the rain for just a few moments and opened his mouth? Why is that proving that Clarice causes him to change? So my answer, because Montag is starting to try things Clarice suggests, such as tasting rain. Also, this is an example of him appreciating nature, which he's never done before meeting her. Okay, how does it prove it? I am going to have a little bit of overlap here between my how and my why. That's not always going to be the case, but sometimes it will be. So for instance, the quote illustrates Montag's new actions, appreciating nature, which is a direct result of his conversation with Clarice. And obviously you can see that appreciating nature being the overlap between the two. So I'm going to take these ideas and I'm going to combine them into a sentence, possibly two sentences, that's going to follow the quote. And this will be my application. So this is what I put together. Prior to his encounters with Clarice, Montag did not even realize there was dew on the grass. But now he is seeking out the wonders of nature, such as the taste and feel of raindrops on his tongue. This experience opens his mind and senses, and as a result, he begins to see how little the brain and senses are used in his world. So here I've taken it and I've talked about how Clarice affects him, how the action is making him become more aware of his world, and also what it's making him realize making him realize the fault of his current world, which is the fact that his world is not using their brain or their senses. And they're really kind of missing out on life. So here's a few application no-nos. First of all, never ever mention the words quote or prove. Please do not follow a quote by saying in this quote or this quote proves or this quote shows. These are huge no-nos. I know it's a quote. You don't need to tell me it's a quote. I know that your application is going to be illustrating how it proves your thesis or your topic sentence, so you don't have to tell me that either. Secondly, don't summarize the quote. Your reader knows what it means. You don't need to repackage it for them. And thirdly, please don't forget the application, because again, without the application, your quote is meaningless. All right, so our final step is to add all the ingredients into the blender and blend them together. And you're going to have this incredibly cohesive, sophisticated, and smooth quote with a lead-in and application, and it's really going to give body to your paragraph. So let's take a look at it all together. Intrigued by Clarice's words and take on the world, Montag, after Clarice leaves, very slowly as he walked, tilted his head back in the rain for just a few moments and opened his mouth. Prior to his encounters with Clarice, Montag did not even realize there was dew on the grass, but now he is seeking out wonders of nature, such as the taste and feel of raindrops on his tongue. This experience opens his mind and senses, and as a result, he begins to see how little the brain and senses are used in his world. I hope this has helped you, and I can't wait to see what you guys all put together.